Yeah, so as many of you perhaps know, this is the second session in a series of seminars called The Archives of Global History in a Time of International Immobility. And it's part of the partnership seminars at the Institute of Historical Research, who are our kind hosts today. I'm one of the co-conveners of the series. My name is Ismay, and along with five brilliant colleagues who are also co-conveners, some of whom are here today. And we all sort of introduced ourselves a little at the first roundtable, which was around a month ago. And in that roundtable, we talked a bit about the general themes of the series, what we'd like to do with it, which is basically to use the moment of the pandemic to think a bit about global history, and especially global history's archival practices, and especially to talk about the inequalities of the field, the limitations of the field, and to imagine what sort of paradigm shift might come out of different people's experiences of doing history in the pandemic. So yeah, we talked about these themes a little in the first seminar, and something that came up was digitization, which was great because we already had this second roundtable planned on the theme of digitization. There's of course been a lot of talk about digitization in light of the pandemic, often linked to ideas of increasing access to archives, making archives more democratic in that sense. Both about digitizing existing paper archives, but also about creating archives that are inherently digital. So with that in mind, this roundtable is going to think about some of the potential of digitization and some of the challenges. My own experience of digital archives is limited to simply as a user. So I'm really looking forward to learning more and getting a wider sense of this from our four panelists on the roundtable, all of whom have been thinking about digital and digitized archives long before the pandemic. So I'm going to just introduce the four speakers briefly, and then we're going to kind of have quite an informal conversation based around some questions that the panelists have been given. So Rustin Zarkar is a co-founder and co-editor at Ajam Media Collective, some of whose work we might hear more about shortly. He is also the Middle East and Islamic Studies librarian at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he is currently completing a PhD at New York University focused on cultural production and circulation around the Caspian Sea. Daniela Agostinho is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Copenhagen with a background in cultural theory, and she is also an independent curator. She's part of the Uncertain Archives Research Collective, who I've just seen have recently published a book that I'm excited to read soon. So congratulations there. Alex Miskin Simple is a project officer at the Rift Valley Institute in Juba. And in this role, he supports the South Sudan National Archives in cataloging and digitizing their records, as well as organizing outreach activities to ensure visibility of the archives through public exhibitions, radio talk shows, school programs, and social media. He's also involved in oral history research methods training in the wider Eastern African region. Melodee Beals is a lecturer in digital history at Loughborough University with expertise in Scottish media history. She is also part of the Oceanic Exchanges Research Group, who have put together the Atlas project of digitized newspapers. And she maintains Scissors and Paste database, which is a fascinating project that traces newspaper transcriptions. So some of these projects and activities we're going to hear more about. To start off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to talk for a few minutes about their work or one aspect of it as it relates to digitization or digital archives. We'll go in alphabetical order of first names. So we could go Alex, Daniela, Melody, and then Rustin. So Alex, if you'd like to start off.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I was excited when I got the invitation. But as I mentioned in my acceptance email, I say that I'm not an archivist by training. I am an anthropologist, a social anthropologist, but I've been fortunate enough to be assigned the role to manage the archives, which I have found really interesting over the past 2 years that I've been engaged in the digitization. So there are many aspects of my work that I have been doing at the Rift Valley Institute. Some of it has been mentioned in the summary of my background there. But I think I will only focus on one aspect which is important for this discussion, which is the digitization and cataloging. I joined this work informally in 2017, but formally 2018, 2019 to now. So this work started a long time ago in 2010, but as I mentioned, I joined it late. But my work has been to support the archives through the internship with the Catholic University here, who we work with them to support with the internship program. I have been overseeing the cataloging and the digitization of the record. That is the main part of the project that has connected me to the archives. And then after that, we thought about what do we want to do more with the archives, because we realized that the archives contain a lot of valuable information that the people in South Sudan and maybe outside could get to use. So we decided to develop the idea of the outreach program. First, we piloted in 2017, where we started by exhibiting at National Parliament, then in markets, and then we decided to start the idea of the radio shows, a school program, and then later, when the pandemic came, so we also decided to shift our focus from public exhibition to continuously update the people on the documents that we find on the archives, and that's how we got to transform our exhibition to social media. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Daniela.
Hi. So I'll just like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this roundtable, even though I'm not in the field of global history. That's very kind of you to have me. So over the last years, I've been working on a project called Uncertain Archives, and part of that, a research project called Archival Encounters, which focuses on the archives of Danish colonialism in the Caribbean islands, formerly known as Danish West Indies, which were renamed to United States Virgin Islands when Denmark sold them to the US in 1917. And the archives documenting this colonial period were digitized by Danish cultural heritage institutions in 2017, sort of to commemorate the centennial of the sale of the islands. And the history of these archives is complicated and contested because these archives were maintained on the islands during the colonial period and then progressively shipped to Denmark already before the sale of the islands, but especially after the sale. So after 1917, the archives were relocated to Denmark. And there were also some parts of the archives which were relocated to Washington after the establishment of the US National Archives in the 1930s. So this is to say that very few records remain on the islands today, and that the bulk of this material is kept in Denmark. And for many years, these records were practically inaccessible to Virgin Islanders unless they traveled to Copenhagen. And so when these archives were digitized and made publicly accessible on an archival platform maintained by the Danish National Archives, this was very much announced as an opportunity to finally access these records and to advance knowledge about this historical period. But this also raised numerous problems that have to do with the question, what is or should be the proper context in which to encounter and engage with these records, bearing in mind that the place where they're located and where they're being accessed from is quite contested. And so this case raises various challenges as well as interesting opportunities that I'm happy to discuss in the course of this conversation.
Thanks.
Hi, let me just sort of echo everyone else when I thank the organizers for bringing us together, because it looks to be a really interesting discussion. So I must admit that my own projects, beginning with my PhD into Scottish migration and Scottish media, into Scissors and Paste, which was sort of my big postdoctoral venture, and then into the Oceanic Exchanges project, it's largely been a case of me trying to fix the various frustrations that I have had working with archives. So when I began my PhD, most of the material that I wanted to use was not digitized. It was, fortunately for me, I was in Scotland and using Scottish newspapers, but I wasn't living in Edinburgh. I did have to commute and then very quickly try to transcribe as many of the newspapers as I could before heading home and trying to process them. And this is not unusual for a historian. Most historians have to do this kind of archival work, but considering the scale of my project and my very limited funding and visa window as an international student, I really did need to try to speed the process up. So I became very good at typing and transcribing. And I had a moment where I thought I had had some kind of mental breakdown because I knew I had already transcribed certain articles that I was currently transcribing. And it came to my awareness, as it did for many young historians, that the newspapers were simply reprinting the same article over and over again, word for word, in entirely different contexts with absolutely no attribution that they had taken it from a different newspaper. So what began as me feeling I had gone insane really became kind of my major postdoctoral work, which was this idea that newspapers did reprint. And as I moved into postdoctorate work, that's when digitization, and especially the raw data from digitized projects, not just the interface people use online, started to really become available to historians. And suddenly the rather impossible task of tracking down all these reprints suddenly became much more possible. So Scissors and Paste was an attempt as an individual, very, very poorly funded postdoctorate to try to use what was available, what was in the public domain, to compare and contrast different archives that were not only of different locations, but housed in different locations with different copyright, different technical abilities, and just whether or not I could get somebody on the phone to ask them if I could do what I wanted to do. And as that moved into Oceanic Exchanges, I actually got to see behind the curtain, so to speak, and work with wonderful people at libraries and archives and commercial publishing houses around the world, sometimes virtually and sometimes actually getting to fly to the Netherlands and to Germany and Australia, New Zealand, and the United States to actually say, how did you do this? Where is the room where your digitization equipment is? And how do you interface with other people in this organization? And that was all wonderful. And that kind of led to the Atlas of Digitized Newspapers and Metadata, where we tried to provide a cohesive encyclopedia of all that information, where the databases came from, what they actually include, and as was mentioned previously, the provenance of those materials, where they actually came from, how they were obtained. And then during our sort of end of our funded project, we were going to have this grand tour of all these libraries where we would present our findings and help new libraries to sort of either digitize their work or to make it more accessible and cross-compatible. And that is when the pandemic hit. And suddenly our grand tour of libraries and hands-on workshops had to be rapidly changed. So it's been kind of poetic in a way that I'm now having to try to do all of this virtually after having had all this physical access. But in the same sense, it's actually opened up my eyes to different ways to communicate this rather than just having someone in the room with me, which in a lot of ways was the original problem. The idea that if you didn't know the person, if you couldn't get them on the phone or talk to them, you didn't have access to that provenance data. And I guess everything that's happened since has just reconfirmed that to me, that we need to make that information not person dependent, I guess. So I guess that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you very much, Rustin.
Hello, everyone. First of all, yeah, thank you for inviting me to this roundtable. I'm very excited to have this conversation with my fellow co-panelists and as well as everybody else on the Zoom call. I'm sure we're going to have a lot to talk about. So to answer this first question about what I've been doing that relates to digitization, digital archives, I guess I'm approaching this question from three angles, right? So one is as a user. So this is probably the longest experience that I have is, as a PhD student, as a master's student, as an undergrad. I work on basically the history of state formation and circulation and regimes of mobility in the Caspian Sea. So I've done a lot of field work in Russia and the Caucasus, but I've really relied heavily on state and university digital collections and digital resources in Persian, Russian, English. So that's kind of where I began my sort of journey into looking at archives, has been just, browsing them, using them, trying to discover materials, which I assume most people have kind of started that way, at least in this Zoom call. And then I guess the next major development has been, as a librarian. So I'm a recent librarian. I came into this position about last year. And as part of my role at UNC Chapel Hill is I review, evaluate, and obtain access to digital resources for our institution's patrons. So that includes, let's say, digitized collections and archives that are subscription-based. That includes trying to find open access resources for our students. And I usually work with publishers to purchase access, but I also, work with undergrads, graduate students, faculty to kind of determine what they need for their research. So I'm really a research facilitator. So questions about, what archives are open, what resources are open to me, that is something that I deal with every day, and kind of it's kind of like a treasure hunt, right? Trying to help somebody else find their materials so they can get their work done. And usually it's happening during finals, so it's a scramble or something. But it's a fun job. But I also work with the university in general to think about archives in a critical light, but also what we can do as an institution. So I've been part of conversations about at UNC about community-driven archives, which I hope to talk about later. I've also, I'm a member of the Digital Collections Steering Committee. So thinking about what UNC can do with its own paper archive, and what are ways to prioritize digitization and what should be prioritized for going online, in terms of like designing a grand sort of strategy for that, which has been really interesting. And I guess the last part is as an editor of Ajam Media Collective, which, if you're not familiar with the resource, is about, it's almost 10 years that we started it, but it's a online platform that covers history, culture, and politics in Iran, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. In this area we call Ajamistan, which is a controversial term that we use just to kind of get people talking, but also at the same time kind of to think about alterity and otherness and margins and that sort of stuff. So as part of this project, we've done, long form articles, we've done podcasts, we've done so many different projects online. So One of my co-founders, Bita Bagulizadeh, has started the Ajam Digital Archive, which focuses on family histories of Iranians, and not just Iranians, but other diaspora communities outside of their home countries. So collecting, family material objects. And for my sort of project, I work very closely with my colleague and partner, Mike Rayburn, who is we working on the Mehala project, or the Mahala project, which is based on kind of documenting neighborhoods that are undergoing state-led beautification programs in the Caucasus and Central Asia and Iran. And part of this has been focusing on a specific neighborhood called Sovietsky in Baku, which was kind of set out for beautification in 2014, 2015. A town, basically a city of a small sort of neighborhood that had around maybe 20 to 50,000 people, with 200 historic sites that were demolished to make way for a very large public park. And so as part of that, we've been using 360-degree cameras. We've been using conventional photography, conventional sort of oral history project methods to try to document this neighborhood as best as we could in the process of demolition, and trying to kind of understand how people have been dealing with, this changing landscape. And so I hope to show the map later in our conversations, but lots of questions about documenting and archiving urban space, about equipment, about expectations, about community work. So I'm happy to explore all those. So I'll just leave it as that for now, and we can talk about that later.
Great, thank you very much. That's great to get a taste of all four of your work. I wanted to ask the next question, that you could kind of pick out what you think might be sort of the most exciting possibility of digital and digitized archives, and the biggest challenge that comes with putting them together, with working with them. So just kind of, one of each, and we'll go in the same order again.
Okay. The question is like, what do you see as the most exciting possibility that archival digitization could offer, and the challenges? So for me, there can be many exciting possibilities that can come with archival digitization, but I've selected a few that I will focus on. Given a strong internet connectivity, I'm speaking based on the context of where I am working in South Sudan, because the access to internet, where we have to have it in order to access these digital records, is also a big deal. So given internet connectivity, archives can be accessed in all places at all times. So what that means is that conventional method of access, to archives will be of less significance. Our archives currently is that people have to walk in if they need to get information about past records. They have to continuously come into the archives. But when we finish the idea of the digitization and we have the ability to have them on cloud, I think it will give access to people where they need them and when they need them. And when the records are less frequently touched, is one of the ideas, because our records are fragile, defined as fragile because they are very old records. They were not protected very well. They're from the colonial period. And so when people come in every time to touch them, we do have the fear that they will, get damaged all the time, because already some of them are in a damaged context. So we think that when we finish the digitization and have access, online access to the archives, so few people will be coming to the archives, and as few people come to the archives, it means that the records the paper records will be there longer enough into the future. That's one of the possibilities there. Archival digitization has the ability to create archival data through the creation of metadata. That makes it easy to search through thousands of files in seconds, especially when people don't have to move to the archives. So what I mean by that is digitization, it goes together with creation of metadata. Because once you have finished digitizing the records, how do you want people to access them? So you have to create metadata so that people will have a platform where they can type keywords. For example, if they are looking for battle, if there was a battle in 1917, they can type in the name of the battle and the year, and they can get to the whole system of the archive. That's another possibility that I think can come as a result of digitization. Unlike in the archives, people have to go and search with boxes in order to identify the right files that they want. I think also that even though we say that there are most possibilities, I've only selected like 3 of them. I'm going to talk about the challenges of the digitization because it's part of the question here. There are many challenges to archival digitization. Practically, although it doesn't require a lot of expertise, to be able to digitize, in which sense I mean to scan and create this metadata. The training does not take long and does not require somebody to go to maybe degree level of archival studies to do this. Sourcing and procuring the right equipment can be very difficult and expensive. We have faced these challenges a lot here in South Sudan, where we have to really struggle a lot to get right equipment from the West mostly. The kind of right equipment also depends on what type of paper that we are trying to scan and how old these papers have been, because some of the current digitization equipment can also destroy the paper if you're not very careful handling them. Second is digitization is a painstaking process, and it requires utmost level of care and responsibility to ensure less damage is caused to the documents being scanned. And again, this is based on the kind of document that I have experience with. It doesn't apply so much to recent files, but to the kind of documents that I deal with. It is really very important to be really very careful while scanning the files. And how much care is needed, of course, it depends on the records and whether they are deemed fragile by definition or not. And that also determines the type of scanner one would need on the station. I did mention that early on. So the most difficult and costly bit of archival digitization, I think, is what we in the South Sudan National Archives and the Rift Valley Institute have not yet reached at, which is later the database. The database, we now have a database where we are collecting the digitized files and storing them locally here, but that's not the goal we want to reach with the digitization. At one point, we want to reach a situation whereby we will have a cloud-based database management system, and I think it is costly. It is going to be very costly for South Sudan to manage that. And we are already beginning to ask questions of where we're going to have this record, stored. Are we going to have them in Juba, or we're going to have them in a sad country, or where are we really going to have them? And I think it is proving to be a bit of a difficult question going forward. And that is a question that I ask really, that where do you transfer the records after you are done digitizing them? To answer this question, we will turn to the question of ethics, which is also part of the question. And I did want to answer the question of ethics in terms of who owns the archive. And the ownership of the archives is also very important. In our case, we are dealing with government records. They are wholly owned by the Ministry of Culture, Museums, and National Archives. And so as Rift Valley Institute and other partners working on the digitization and cataloging work at the National Archives, we do not have any right, of ownership to this. And so coming up later with the issues of how do we use them, how do we store them, we'll also go back to what the ministry says. And this document, like I mentioned, dates back to the colonial period, and few of them are post-colonial documents. And some of these documents, would share the information into how colonization happened in Sudan and in South Sudan, and the definition of how people access them will be very critical when the government decides to share this information later. For instance, this is the example I mentioned. So, and what is very important to know about ethical and ownership here is that South Sudan do not currently have an act or a bill that controls or that informs how archive is accessed and how archive is informed. I mean, in South Sudan. And right now, the ministry and partners who are interested in working in the archives are only restricted to dealing with the archives records that were already collected. So we are waiting for the bill or the act that will give us access to even going beyond Juba to collect records that are there. It will either be we will go there to create, digitize, temporary digitization unit where we'll only bring the records. It depends on what the government will really come up with, whether we collect these records to bring them to Juba. And so if archival policies do not support full access to digitized records, we can wonder if whether digitization of records can lead to democratization with the big team there. And I think the whole thing about this discussion is whether digitization of records can create access. And if they are not able to create quick access, easy access to records, then the democratization of records becomes a bit difficult. And I think this is how I try to answer the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting for me as a user to get a sense of these questions of ownership and the legal structures surrounding access and ownership too. Thank you. Daniela.
I think I need to start by thanking Alex for laying this out and just second everything that he has already said. This was really great. But thinking about the challenges and opportunities raised by this specific project of the Danish Colonial Archives, perhaps I could start with the challenges, and they will certainly echo many aspects that Alex has already raised. And one is, we could say, a challenge on the institution or policy level, which is the fact that digitization in many European institutions has become sort of the default strategy to increase public and citizen involvement in questions regarding cultural heritage. And so digitization has become more of an imperative than a process in most Western institutions. And this has led to an equation of digitization with democratization or democratic access that goes very unchallenged, right? And Alex has mentioned these problems already, like the problem of internet connectivity, which is not a given. It's not equally distributed. Also the question of metadata that kind of reproduces the colonial classification of this collection. And so it's not possible to research in these digital archives through other metadata. And so we kind of have to follow the already existing metadata. And so that kind of often prompts us to do research through highly problematic terms that we do not want to use, but that's the ones that are kind of there. So you find yourselves researching researching terms that perhaps should be kind of challenged, and also it's not possible to do research if you don't already know those terms, like if you don't know the names of, for instance, the plantations, that the records from those plantations. So if you don't know, you won't find those resources. So there's a problem with metadata as well, and often digitization in this cultural institutions leads to sort of generic one-size-fits-all strategies of activating and engaging publics that do not always suit the specificities of each collection. In particular, colonial collections or collections about historical conflicts. I'm thinking about, for instance, data sprints, and I had some experience with this, like how do you organize a data sprint with data that is highly sensitive and problematic? Should you be like sprinting on that data at all, right? Or should we come up with different strategies to address that material? And so I think there isn't a lot of incentive to reflect on who constitutes this kind of publics that are supposed to be activated or engaged. Or sometimes there is a deliberate choice to center an homogeneous national public as the main constituent or beneficiary of digitization. And this is an institutional political challenge that has to do with how digitization is often tied to nationalism, and in European nations in particular, often these digitization processes are sort of framed as instruments to foster social cohesion or national identity or whatever, instead of actually challenging that. And so the digitized collections end up reflecting some of those problems that have to do with national ideas about heritage. And this is something that Stuart Hall has already written about many years ago in an article called "Whose Heritage?" Right? And I think he laid out those problems there really well. And a second challenge, which is sort of a consequence of this, is curatorial. We could call it that, which is to think about how to properly contextualize these records. And so, because these archives are very much, when digitized and made accessible, these archives are very much organized through the logics of colonial collection, and it does little to contextualize these materials from the perspective, the knowledge and experience of the residents of the Virgin Islands, right? And this is in particularly problematic because of how these archives were removed from the islands, and how that relocation, let's call it that, of the archives left Virgin Islanders without access to their history for 100 years. And there are numerous questions here, but I could focus here on the problems raised by particularly photographic archives, which is the part of the archives that I'm mostly preoccupied with right now. And so there's a lot of records that contain visual material, namely of people who appear unnamed or with given names, and there's very little information about them. And this is often people photographed against their will and that appear in these archives, but were not active producers of these archives. And so the challenge is not only a matter of representation, but also of how digital infrastructures transform the way these images are disseminated. And so what are the consequences of these images entering digital spaces that nowadays are characterized by new automated curation processes? So once these images are put online, they start appearing in all kinds of digital spaces outside the archival platform, right? I'm thinking about social media. And so they kind of start circulating in other contexts. So they were already decontextualized. And so what happens when they're further recontextualized in these spaces, and so kind of obtain a visibility they were never meant to have. And so sometimes it's even a problem here to raise this question, because often when I mention this, I'm met with a reaction of, okay, what is the alternative? To hide history or pretend it never happened, right? And it seems to me that, between the hyper visibility that comes from onlining these materials and simply putting these materials away forever in a kind of protective sort of approach to difficult archives, there's an entire spectrum of interesting possibilities. And I think it's, in this sort of spectrum, there's a lot of potential to properly care for these materials. And this kind of sort of perhaps brings me to the opportunities or the exciting possibilities that you ask about. And so many scholars in critical digital heritage propose to understand digitization not as a linear process of making something analog digital, but as a process that transforms a collection, right? And I would add to that through this process, digitization can also have a potential for social transformation if we spend more time and resources on devising alternative infrastructures for these digitized materials. And this is something that I've been working on with colleagues here in Denmark and in the Virgin Islands, how to create better infrastructures to access and contextualize these materials. And here I would like to flag the work of the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, which is a Black feminist collective from the Virgin Islands, who has been imagining a virtual museum to rehouse these materials that have been digitized by the Danish archives. And so to present them in a different setting that centers the relation that Virgin Islanders have to these materials. And so this is in itself a curatorial practice. And this is something that I emphasize in in an article that I wrote, and which is kind of a plea for institutions to think of care beyond preservation, and to think of care of collections more as a relation, as a way to repair or restore the relation between these materials and the communities they document. And so, of course, this also ties to questions of restitution, of collections, and because in this case of the US Virgin Island archives, there are infrastructural and political challenges to an actual restitution. I could talk a little bit more about that, but in this case, digitization could be like a driver for a more creative form of restitution, in which like a virtual museum would sort of allow Virgin Islanders to sort of use the materials that have already been digitized and put them in a different infrastructure, and sort of reorganize the material through different metadata, through different forms of contextualization, and also to put it in dialogue with, for instance, artistic interventions on that material, etc. So yeah, I think the exciting possibility here would be to see digitization not as an end into itself, but sort of kind of as a means towards something else, a more interesting way of engaging with these materials.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting to see some of the threads of that going through, and to think about the kind of importance of publics, how publics are imagined during this process, and of a kind of transformational a transformational idea whereby there's not the end project, that there's also a kind of a relationship to then be made between the material and the public. That's really great. Melodee.
Hi, thank you very much both to Daniela and Alex. I've been taking furious notes, and I feel bad for Rustin, who's going to have to, talk to 3 different people afterwards, but I'll try to keep to my time. So there's a lot of really interesting ideas that have come out from my own work, and from sort of hearing the slightly different but eerily similar experiences that both Alex and Daniela were speaking about. And I think the one thing I want to talk about most of all is access, and the particular variant I want to talk about is who the public is in regards to who the archive is. So, and maybe Rustin will have a bit of an insight on this. I, as a newspaper historian, was primarily working with libraries as opposed to archives. They have a very different collection remit, and they have a very different access remit to the archives I've worked for in my other historical work. And what I principally found is that people like myself, historians in an academic institution, were of very little concern to the librarians, or and perhaps rightly so. They didn't negatively view us. They actually quite liked our assistance and quite liked chatting with us, but we were just another user of the library. The library's audience was the general public who wanted to use the library for very different reasons. So one of the archives I worked at, one of the libraries, was in Australia, and they had many different questions of access that I had just never really thought of before. As a continent-sized nation state, they have very large rural communities that are very, very far away from metropolitan centers. So the idea of making newspapers and other materials available to their citizens and their residents as their rights as citizens and residents was seen as most feasible through digitization, as opposed to requiring people to have to travel hundreds, if not thousands of miles to get to a research library, that should not be the preserve of a few people in ivory towers. And I thought that was a very good point. Even having grown up in sort of the middle of California, I perhaps didn't realize just how lucky I was to live, if not next to archives, at least relatively close to the cities that held these large regional archives. The other thing about access that was really interesting was the political questions that I think both Alex and Danielle touched upon in different ways, which is, if you as a well-endowed National Library Service have resources to digitize for other countries or other regions that do not have the ability to digitize, is that okay? Is that, you know, seen as something that is useful? Because obviously you're going to be bringing your own sense of what should be digitized, how it should be organized, how it should be presented to material that belongs to another community. But that other community may not have the resources to make that available themselves. So, you know, it's a partnership, it's a good thing in some respects, but then there are questions about how it will be perceived. What are the optics of a big wealthy nation going around and digitizing the resources of less well-off nations? So it depends on how you do that. And I think that question for me was raised very prominently when I was in New Zealand, because there are these lovely collections in the library of Maori artifacts that I thought were beautiful. And I was really concerned that they weren't being digitized. I felt like they were, you know, being left out of all of these programs. And I thought that wasn't very fair to these beautiful indigenous collections. And then it was made to me abundantly clear that they weren't being excluded out of a negative feeling, but that the archivists felt that some of them had been unethically obtained materials and they didn't have the right to digitize them. And that raised the question of who owns the materials corporatively when hundreds of years have passed. Because on the one hand, you can say, you know, well, the indigenous communities own it. Well, yes, but the indigenous communities who technically own this material have, you know, been passed away for hundreds of years sometimes. And just because somebody is a great grandson of that person does not necessarily give them the right to say, yes, it's okay, or no, it's not. So these are ethical questions with no simple answer. And I really loved Daniela's discussion about reconstituting the archives in different ways. And I think part of that for me was always in the discussion of metadata. I've always been a very big proponent of indexes over full text searching, simply because full text searching is never 100% correct. And it's very difficult to know what words were used at the time for modern terminology. And obviously people categorize things differently. So it's useful to have indexes to kind of conceptually put things together. And I always thought one of the biggest advantages of digitization was not that we were going to get boxed into some sort of archaic 1920s Library of Congress category system, but that we could use that because that was really useful for understanding how people thought of this information in the 1920s. But we could also use the 19th century indexes, and we could have that as another layer of metadata. And we could have different communities who use or who have some sort of relationship with this data have their own metadata ontologies, their own hierarchies of metadata. And that way you're offering so many different doorways to get to that same record, but lots of different ways of thinking about it. And so for me, part of it is democratization of allowing the archives to be visible to lots and lots of people who may not have access otherwise, which I think on balance is usually a good over an ethical concern. But the idea of being able to categorize it in different ways and frame it and contextualize it in lots of overlapping ways, and not saying that the old way is bad and the new way is good. Because in 20 years, we're going to say that the new way is good and the middle new way was bad. But having all of these layers available as themselves historical records, I always thought was a really beautiful way of that digitization could improve the archives. And I think if you'll indulge me for just one more second, the last thing I really wanted to sort of touch on was the idea of preservation, which Alex touched on very, very briefly. Having worked with newspapers, they're ephemera. They were never meant to last this long. And I'm amazed that most of them have lasted this long, the ones that are paper. And I am genuinely worried that we are the last generation of people who can actually touch these. And there is value to materiality and to actually seeing what it was like to look on the newspaper and to hold it and things like that. And I think digitization wants to make that available for longer, but we have to be creative about how we digitize and how we give metadata. So as much of the materiality can be acknowledged, if not duplicated. And I think that's where I'll leave it when I hand it off to Rustin.
Yeah, thank you. That the idea that a digitized record can have kind of multiple overlapping contexts, which in some senses isn't possible when it's, you know, one file in one archive. That's a kind of a nice way to think of these possibilities. Rustin, over to you.
Well, this is quite the obstacle to try to synthesize and respond to everyone. So please bear with me as I try to do that. But yeah, I just want to appreciate my colleagues' responses, and I think that, you know, they've really touched on some amazing points on, you know, the technical capacity, you know, the problems with metadata, like infrastructure problems, patrons who are, you know, and even the question in the chat right now. So like, who is the public, you know, whom the archives are for? Like, you know, these are all things that, you know, I'm glad that we got to touch on a little bit. And for me, for my specific sort of foray into this question, I think I want to focus on maybe to make this question about not like what are archives for, but who is digitization for? And also to think about it, you know, as a librarian, as a user, but also the specific case of the Melodee project. So I guess like to kind of start off, like, I mean, there are like, you know, some new methods, new tools and approaches out there that will allow many people to digitize materials for their own communities. So I'm kind of thinking about a community-driven approach, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But and this is something that I've also been thinking about as, you know, a librarian during COVID, when people are asking for digitization. They want materials to be public, to be electronic. So I'm trying to think about you know, even at UNC, we're like thinking about patron-driven digitization, where like somebody comes to us from the community or from one of the researchers, and they're like, we need this digitized, this specific document. And so having a model that's like, okay, like we're going ad hoc based on what people want at an institution is very different than having a very large sort of strategy about digitizing paper materials, right? So that's one thing that I want to get into. The next thing that I'll talk about is just about, you know, new initiatives. So like, you know, digital first initiatives at institutions, born digital materials being archived, web archiving projects. Like, so these are just in terms of like general things that I think are really sort of interesting and we could explore a little bit more. But when I was kind of devising this, I spent a lot of time on the constraints and the challenges. And I'm like, wow, there's so many challenges, especially for kind of discussing this question of who is digitization for. And so, you know, originally, if you asked me a question like about this as like 5 years ago, I'd be like, well, clearly, you know, the digitization is for me, like as a PhD student, as a, you know, like I didn't have the thought to think about, oh, these are materials that have been decontextualized, that are coming from specific places, that are, and that archivists are doing amazing work that try to make legible to us, right? So if I'm working with a manuscript, I'm not necessarily thinking, 5 years ago when I was working on a manuscript, I wasn't necessarily thinking about how that manuscript ended up in that digital library. So I guess the question that I have is like, if I were to think about a community-driven archive where the idea is to empower the members of the community about those materials that were produced, like how does this model really not work? How does it not mesh? And I was thinking about it through various grant-giving organizations, through various projects I've developed in the past, and I'm like thinking about like, wow, actually this doesn't add up, right? So on the first hand, like to go to metadata and the technical things, like, you know, spending $10,000 on a digitization rig where you're getting DSLRs and huge rigs and this sort of stuff could be prohibitive for people who actually need to do this work, and they actually have to rely on certain grants. At the same time, like grant-giving organizations, they have specific standards for digitizing, cataloging, and creating metadata. All of this, some of this is really great, right? So like you want high scans, you want really good quality things that can last for decades. But at the same time, if you're thinking about the average person who's a member of this community, why do they need like a, you know, a giant TIFF file when they're totally happy with a PDF, right? Like, so thinking about expectations of, let's say, institutions like libraries or archives or grant organizations and thinking about the people that have a personal or family or historical relationship with these materials, like they have different preferences. And so I think the biggest challenge is figuring out how to, meet the needs, like in a very sort of like realpolitik way. Like, like on one hand, you want the grant, right? So like you need to like play by the rules of these organizations. At the same time, like if you're going to do this work and you're going to rely on, the generosity, hospitality, and the cultural output of, a community, then like you need to respond to their needs, right? Or at least empower the people to do the work, right? So I'm thinking about traditional models of digitization, right? So like the sort of old custodian way of doing things. So the old way of like, doing things is like, materials are either purchased outright or, they're donated to an institution, and these things are digitized. And so a lot of communities that maybe are historically marginalized, that kind of have, been disenfranchised by this extractive or colonial practice, like maybe they don't have a lot of trust with that organization. Maybe there, as Daniela painted out, like there's a bunch of access issues when it comes to doing things in a certain way. So I think that there are things that one can do, right, to address this problem of the traditional model for digitization, right? So I think about some of the models that I've been working with some of my colleagues at UNC, which is A, post-custodial archiving, right? And B, community-driven approaches. So post-custodial archiving, for those who are not familiar, is specifically against this extractive model of taking materials out of the context in which they were produced. And I think a really great organization that is like this is ACASA at NYU Abu Dhabi. They're a photographic archive, and they're doing great work by basically working with holders of this materials, the original custodians of these materials, bringing them to a site, digitizing them, and then the materials are brought back, right? So, and I think of that in context, like in comparison to another project I know that was done in Afghanistan several years ago, where they just went in with hundreds of thousands of dollars, went to bookstores, bought as many things as they could, brought it back to the institution, and digitized everything on site, created English-only language metadata, and like basically completely divorced the objects from their the original holders. So thinking about and there's been plenty of work done on post-custodial archiving, like plenty of essays out there, and I encourage people to take a look at it. But that's something that we have tried to do with Mehele, at least in terms of when we are working with material objects, right? Making sure, for example, we created a exhibition in Baku about the neighborhood. And one of the things we did was like, it wasn't the creation of an archive per se, but for the exhibition, we contacted members of the community, say, hey, we're doing this exhibition. If you have any sort of family items or photographs that you would like to donate to us, like we can digitize them, bring them back to you, and then create an exhibition that way. So post-custodial archiving has been some of the things I've been really interested in. And then of course, related to this is community-driven approaches. So whereas one hand, like they seem similar, but they're kind of different, right? So the post-custodial archiving is bringing materials out and bringing them back in. Whereas a community-driven approach is, working with community members to build infrastructure, to provide training, to digitize, so people can digitize materials on their own needs in their own way, right? And kind of determine what they personally need as a community. And I think that UNC has done a really great job with working with various communities in the Outer Banks in North Carolina. So like the island chains that are on the eastern side of historically marginalized communities due to the history of slavery in North Carolina. So especially communities that have a very sort of have a very strong distrust with the history of the University of North Carolina as one of the institutions of slavery, right? So how do you work with community members when there is this sort of history of materials being taken away, materials being put away in places that people did not have access to them? So there's plenty of amazing work being done on community-driven approaches. And for a project that I'm working on in Pakistan, we're working with members of specific religious communities to be like, okay, like what are your needs? What do you want to be digitized? And in terms of building that infrastructure, working with our grant organizations to be like, okay, like maybe, you know, there's how much money can we put for workshops? How much money can we use for a rig? And like making sure that those things stay there for that work to be done once the project is gone, right? So that's one thing. And I guess to talk about the ethical, so another opportunity, I guess, is more digital pedagogy for humanities students. You know, I think the part of the reason that I have all these questions and I get excited about it now is just because I didn't have that as with a trained Middle East Islamic studies approach, right? My experience was always like, you go to the site, you go to the archives, you speak to the archivist there, you get materials, and then you leave, right? Which you don't really have a general understanding of how metadata is created. You don't have a general understanding of how archiving as a profession works, right? And just having that sort of discussion with PhD students, with graduate students about how archives are built is incredibly important. How things are digitized is incredibly important, right? So I hope, and I know that there's plenty of organizations doing really good work about creating more seminars, especially in the time of COVID, for understanding like the more information sciences sort of things. And I think that that's something that that's a trend I really enjoy seeing. Another thing is international partnerships and consortia, right? If an institution, and I think, like, of course, we have to worry about the colonial and neo-colonial dimensions of some of these dynamics, right? But if an institution does have money, if that money is used in a particular way to build infrastructure, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, right? So international partnerships that are using local knowledge, that are engaging with local staff, local expertise to identify and to digitize is really important, especially as, you know, someone like myself who's sitting at a US-based institution in an area studies department, which already has a fraught history, right? So that's one of the things. And I guess I don't want to speak for too long, and I feel like I'm speaking really fast. I just want to give you know, my colleagues more time to speak, and especially for the next questions. But when it relates to the Melodee project, I can think about you know, some of the specific concerns that we had about ethics when we were producing an archive of urban space, right? So the first is security and safety, right? You know, we're working with a very politically sensitive project because it's directly related to, you know, something that's happening on the ground that the security forces have been involved in, that there's protests around. So like, how can you guarantee the safety? And oftentimes you can't, right? And making sure that that is known to somebody, and making sure that there are agreements, well, that people understand what the project is, right? People understanding what your role is there. Like if somebody asks you like what you're doing there, we had this tough time where on one hand, we were like, this is a heritage project. We're trying to create a repository of sights and sounds of this neighborhood. And then people are like, oh, great. Like, so this is going to be used to help stop the demolition of this neighborhood, you know? And like, so there was a mismatch by certain members of the community about what our goal of the project was and what the project could be used for. So it was something that I think that going back, we would have reflected a little differently about how we would have discussed what the project is and what it could be done, and how it could be utilized. So that's just one thing about expectations and preferences. And I think along the way, like, it was a learning experience. I just wish that I had that training beforehand, right? So like, and I think part of the problem is that, you know, especially as the term archive gets really used and thrown out there, like everybody is building an archive. Like everybody's a PhD student has an archive, right? Even though like maybe they've never done information science, maybe they've never really spoken to a librarian, maybe they don't even know what an archivist really does, right? But everybody is building an archive. So I really want to like insist that, like, you know, there's a lot of amazing people out there who are doing amazing work. And, you know, the problem is that a lot of times as we're kind of stuck in, you know, the job market push, as we're kind of stuck in professionalization of academia, like we're thinking about like publications or special projects or things to like market ourselves as in a very selfish way, without actually realizing, you know, there are plenty of people who like know how to do these things, have the technical capacity to do these things. Let's reach out to them. And in fact, they're at our institutions, right? And so I just think that, you know, that's something that I wish that this was something that, you know, we could reflect on a little bit more, and maybe we can talk about it in this roundtable a little bit more. And I keep saying that I want to show the map, and I hope that we can do that at the end in a few minutes before the end of the session. But I want to give everyone more time to speak. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that I certainly relate to this this problem that graduate students, PhD students in general, are not encouraged or forced enough to think about these broader issues instead of just approaching an archive in its as a resource for their own personal work.